When I reached for my place card, there was nothing. No chair, just a table set for 12, candles lit, the soft clink of glassware, and a dap at the far end where my name should have been. It felt like someone had cut a photograph in half and expected me not to notice the ragged edge. He chuckled, the kind of nervous, small sound Sean makes when he thinks a joke will smooth over something bigger. "Oops," he said, half to me, half to the room. "Guess we miscounted." I looked at the table, at Eleanor, at the slow, practiced tilt of her head, and I said, without raising my voice, "Seems I'm not family." That was it. I turned, I left. I stepped out of the rooftop restaurant into the Roman night like a woman taking a breath too long held. The city smelled of citrus and diesel and something faintly sweet from a pastry cart down the street. The party did not follow. They did not call after me. They called each other, in clipped little bursts, laughter that sounded like glass. You have 100 versions of how something like that could unfold in your head. You think about shouting. You think about throwing a glass. You imagine the scene replayed in a dozen social media montages. I thought none of those things. I thought of contracts. If you spend half your life organizing other people's most calculated moments, temple weddings, corporate launches, gallery openings, you learn to read people in details. A place card is a choice. A missing place card is a message. Eleanor had the money to signal. She also had the habit of signaling with gestures that were precise and cold. That night was signature Eleanor, an omission that declared a whole narrative. If this is the kind of story that pulls at something inside you, if you've ever been sidelined in a room you helped to furnish, stick around. I tell these stories because they matter. If you'd like more, subscribe, and you'll find a few other ways people reclaim what was quietly taken from them. I grew up in a house that smelled like lemon oil and printer ink. My father ran a small printing shop. My mother taught piano lessons in our living room. I learned how to make things look and sound like bigger, more comfortable truths. When I was 19, I organized a friend's fundraiser in a church hall and charged $20 a ticket. By the time I was 25, Elite Affairs had a roster of repeat clients and a florist who swore I had a sixth sense for table flow. Boston taught me to work for everything that looks effortless. It was all contract clauses and contingency plans, a ledger of what-ifs, and the quiet hours after a wedding when the band had finally stopped, and we inventoried the mismatched candlesticks. Sean met me at a charity gala. He liked to say he noticed the way I orchestrated the seating so a donor ended up next to the artist he wanted to fund. He was funny. He was good at attending. He was everything people in his world expected. Polished, advantageous, prone to a laugh that filled silence. We married in a small chapel on the North Shore. Eleanor came in a pale green suit, immaculate. She congratulated me in a way that included my name, but also felt like the insertion of a clause. "Happy for Sean," she said. "Welcome to our family." At dinner that night, she adjusted a place setting and did not look at me when she said, "It's so important, to have things done properly." Proper, in Caldwell terms, meant inherited ways and quiet supervision. It was a world of correct linens and correct schools and correct alliances. I had not walked into the family intending to remake it. I built a reputation that let me sit at Vince Morelli's kitchen table and settle whether his wedding needed peonies or gardenias. I made Elite Affairs a brand that meant dependable elegance. The more work I did for the Caldwells, the more they expected me to be both invisible and indispensable. Arrange their parties, fix their oversights, but never be the story. There were small things at first. A misnamed plate at a luncheon, a delayed payment that arrived after a blush of explanation, an offhand comment about how event planners who'd worked their way up were always so keen to prove themselves. Eleanor's gloves were always spotless, her voice cool. Once, at a family reunion, she took the microphone and thanked everyone by name, except me. She called me Mr. Caldwell's wife, in the way a label might be applied to an artifact. I smiled. I sampled the antipasti. I moved on. You learn to catalog slights in the margins, because the margins are where the pattern emerges. 1 is chance. 2 is coincidence. 5 is habit. I kept an inventory, not because I wanted to harbor grievances, but because my job trained me to track details. There were other fractures too. Vendor invoices came back with strange notations.
A deposit for a summer soiree arrived late after thin apologies and promises. Sean would say I called the bank and leave unstated what call he had actually made. Once, a seating chart I had labored over for weeks, patterned napkins, a compromise between Aunt Lila's allergies and the artist's need to sit near the gallery owner, was shifted without my knowledge. Plates moved. A guest who should have been by the window found himself at the center. Eleanor smiled and said, "We wanted a change for the evening." That smile had teeth. If you are an event planner, you build your life around clarity. Contracts, receipts, a chain of emails that read like the spine of a book. The Caldwells, for all their opulence, were sloppy with the formalities that keep businesses honest. Notes omitted, authorizations have completed. At first, I chalked it up to a household used to people taking care of things for them. Then I noticed it wasn't negligence. It was strategy. Sean was not evil. He was complicated.
He wanted to be both married to me and comfortable in the family script. There were nights he would come home, collapse beside me on the living room couch, and apologized for some oversight before he could finish a sentence. He apologized like a child being scolded. There were other nights when he excused himself from small cruelties by saying something like, "It's just how she is." It felt like living with a man who was affectionate, but had a second self that was built out of people's expectations. The Rome dinner was scheduled months in advance. Eleanor was turning 60. Her friends would arrive from Paris and London, her nephews from New York. It was to be the week of small pleasures, a villa for a few days outside the city, a vineyard tour, a yacht cruise, dinner at a rooftop restaurant overlooking the Tiber. I had orchestrated elements of the week, menus, an intimate ensemble for an afternoon at the villa, the flowers that would double as part of a chapel installation for Eleanor's favorite cause. I would have liked to be there. I was not invited to help with the final touches. By the spring, the family had insisted on using their private manager, Carmen, to coordinate the villa, while still asking me to suggest readings and music. That was the pattern. Keep the brand, remove the author. The last time I had a clear conversation with Sean about the dinner was 2 days before we left Boston. He asked me, somewhat guiltily, if I would still want to come. I hesitated because I had seen the crumb trail of slights. I wanted to believe he would make it different. He said, "We want it to be intimate. Eleanor asked for the people she loves." He paused. "Are you okay with that?" I swallowed and said yes. I had been married for 5 years. I wanted, in small private moments, to be the kind of wife who stayed. I bought a dress. I bought plane tickets. I packed my planner's calm in the fold of a suitcase and convinced myself I would be fine if things were not perfect. When I landed in Rome, the city was as cinematic as everyone says. Lemon trees leaned over balconies like conspirators. The villa where the family had reserved a few rooms smelled faintly of basil. At dusk, we had drinks on the terrace, and they toasted Eleanor and spoke of it as if it were inevitable that the week would fall into place. It was the kind of ritual that comforted them. For me, rituals had always been work. The first real sign something was wrong came from a text that was not meant for me. I saw it because I was in our bedroom, ironing a shirt for Sean, when his phone chimed on the bedside table. He had left it face up to charge. I should have ignored it. I did not. A preview of a message from V flashed across the screen. "Can't wait to start our new life." The date was a month prior. The tone was casual as a plan. I did not read further. I closed the home screen and walked out to the terrace with the iron in my hand and a professional calm filling me from the scalp down. You ever see a detail in a design that changes the whole pattern? That text did that for me. I went downstairs. I did not say anything. I put the iron away and went about the dinner I had been invited to attend as a guest rather than a partner. It would have been possible to confront him then and there, in a hotel room smelling of starch and lemon. It would have been very private and messy, and possibly the beginning of a long, shared grief. I chose not to. I am not a dramatic person by temperament. I am deliberate because my work requires it. I took the discovery as data. There was more to be known. Over the next 12 hours, I found more. That is what discoveries are. One small break yields a seam that opens. A few minutes after the text, a draft of a public statement sat in an email folder Sean had left open on the laptop in the living room. He had been using it for work. He forgot to close it. The subject line read, "Proposed Statement, Caldwell Family." It was a short, carefully worded document about personal matters and the need for privacy. It read as if it had been composed by a publicist and revised by someone attempting to make betrayal sound tidy. There was also a spreadsheet. It wasn't a glamorous document. It was a ledger with transferred lines and annotations. I am not an accountant. I don't claim to be, but I know how money flows through events. There were entries that did not sit right, transfers between the family trust and a holding account labeled Reserve Discretionary. There were vendor notes scratched in by hand. One line said in shorthand, "Cover until PR settled." Another said, "Personal expenses to be reconciled." I took photographs. I made copies. I did what any professional would do when presented with a material: preserve it. I sent a secure message to my lawyer back in Boston, short, encrypted, requesting advice and protection. I did not at that stage mention the texts. I wrote, "Found documents that raise questions about family funds and a draft press release. Need counsel on preserving evidence." The reply came back with calm professionalism. "Preserve originals. Do not alter. Document chain. We will advise." There was an old habit in me from the days of last-minute venue problems. Do not let panic be the first response. Panic invites mistakes. Strategy invites action. I began to inventory who would notice what and who would be loyal to what I had built. My authority over the week of events, I realized, was more intact than I had let myself remember. Months before, when the initial conversations about Eleanor's birthday had begun, I had been asked to supply vendor lists and seating suggestions. In the letter of intent I executed for Elite Affairs, the family had signed agreements that named my firm as the point of contact for floral arrangements, the musician schedule, and some logistics. It was not all-encompassing. Carmen ran the villa, the yacht company had its own contract, but the contracts I had were real. Deposits were held in accounts that my company managed, and that, in the ordinary course, required my authorization to shift. They were, in short, the kind of modest levers a planner accrues over a decade. That is not the same thing as power. It is the architecture of order. It meant that if I called a vendor and said, "The client has postponed," they had an obligation to my company to respond. If I instructed a caterer according to the terms in our contract, they could not ignore me without legal repercussions. That is all. It is hardly theatrical, but it is sufficient. I called Marco first. Marco was the manager at the rooftop restaurant where Eleanor's dinner would be held. He had been a reliable ally on many an occasion, never a friend, but a man who appreciated a clear line of communication and a check that cleared on time. I had worked with him for years. We spoke in halves of sentences shaped by calendars and contingencies. "Marco," I said, "this is Anna Malone at Elite Affairs. I need to confirm an update about the table for this evening." He laughed, a warm sound. "Senora Malone, always a pleasure. The table is set. The guests will adore the new sommelier selection." I did not unfold the list of grievances. I was practical. "Please hold. I will confirm in 30 minutes. We hung up. I did not call to argue. I called to arrange for possible alternatives. I called vendors with a single statement, that my company was acting as agent and might need to exercise our authority to postpone or cancel elements tied to an internal family dispute. I did not say more. I asked about refund policies, about backup plans, about whether deposits were refundable in full or subject to vendor discretion. It was drab corporate work, the kind that looks unromantic until the moment it matters. As I considered courses of action, I kept circling back to that missing place card. The omission was public. It was also a symbolic gambit. Exclusion is meant to wound quietly and to signal weakness. It had worked on them for years. Eleanor's family saw her as a matriarch. They had rehearsed histrionics together for generations. The missing card was a performance that required no further explanation. I could have chosen to respond in kind. Many lines of the imagination suggested how satisfying that would be. I could have gone back to the table and, with some speech, exploded their little theater. I did not. I decided to use what I had built for my work. That decision was a moral one, to reclaim dignity without sinking to their level. There is a difference between revenge and recalibration. I needed to make the week, Eleanor's week, publicly difficult in a way that matched the quiet humiliation I had received. I wanted them to experience the unraveling of the veneer they relied upon, but I wanted to do it with clarity. No unlawful acts, no forgeries, no invasions of privacy beyond the documents that had been left where anyone could see them. I made calls that relied on contract terms, on vendor relationships, on the fact that I was the person whose signature could, in legitimate circumstances, authorize cancellations. I remember sitting at a cafe across from the restaurant, the night cool and the city alive. Sean sent me a message, one of those that pretends battered affection can be smoothed with a few words, and I read it on a screen that suddenly looked like a small, irrelevant rectangle. He asked if I was all right. I typed, "I'm fine. Please don't make a scene tonight." He replied, "We can fix this. Come back." I did not. Not yet. Instead, I began the work of preserving myself. I photographed the documents, I saved copies of message threads that I had a right to, I sent secure messages to my lawyer, and I made phone calls that were not about theatricality, but about the practical. Can vendors be advised? What would happen if events were postponed under the authority of the contracted planner? Would deposits be held? Would the family be accountable? I made a list of names. Marco, the rooftop manager. Carmen, the villa manager. Luca, a small vineyard outside Rome that had agreed to a private tasting. Salvatore, the skipper we had arranged for a short afternoon along the coast. Each had contracts. Each had timelines. In my mind, I saw the week as a delicate machine of small payments, deposits, staffing schedules, and purchased perishable goods. It is amazing how much of a life you can cancel by dialing the right numbers and citing the right clauses. I also documented the human parts. I noted who would likely take what side. Melissa and Grant had always been quiet arbiters. They wanted harmony. Thomas was a showman who dismissed complicating details. Sean, in his way, was adept at standing in the center and hoping things did not fall apart. Eleanor, when disturbed, could wield the society press like a blade. That possibility worried me less than it once might have. If a family chooses to script its own public exposure, the press does not always know how to resist a well-crafted narrative. When I called Carmen, her voice was measured. She had always run the family's villa with a kind of efficient discretion. "Senora Malone," she said, "we have everything arranged, meals lined up, staff ready." "Are the deposits refundable?" I asked. There was a slight pause. "We have deposits on linens and a wine delivery. The yacht company requires final confirmation this afternoon." "Place them on hold," I said. "My firm is the contracted planner." "We are instructed by the client to evaluate and potentially postpone activities due to a family emergency. I will send an instruction." She acquiesced. It was not loyalty so much as professional caution. Vendors do not usually side in family feuds. They side with contracts, because contracts are the structure of their livelihood. By the time I returned that evening, I had a small stack of correspondences. I had written to Marco, "Please hold any additional service until you receive confirmation from Elite Affairs." I had messaged the vineyard, "We may need to postpone, hold the staff, and release the fruitier vins." I had drafted formal emails that cited the clauses my company had executed. I did not engineer anything. I exercised my authority honestly. Back at the villa, I packed a small bag. I did not tell Sean where I would be overnight. He called once and left a message. I did not listen to it until much later. There is something clean about being the person who knows what they will do next. It narrows the field of decision. That night, I lay awake and considered the cadence of the coming days, the possible reactions. A family built on social performance is brittle when the script is stripped. Their currencies are impressions and appearances. My instruments were receipts and signatures. The disparity between the two is not unfair. It is pragmatic. In the dark of the villa bedroom, I rehearsed the line I had said on the rooftop. "Seems I'm not family." The phrase felt small and adequate. It was not a battle cry. It was a fact statement. Short, precise, impossible to argue with. That clarity steadied me. Morning came with business-like light. I called my lawyer to confirm the chain of custody for the documents I had found. She advised me to keep originals intact. She suggested I not circulate anything publicly. She recommended that if I took any course of action, it be supported by documentation, and that I inform the parties involved of any legitimate cancellations in writing through proper channels. Her voice was the voice of procedure. It was a comfort. I also sat down with my planner's notepad and made a grid. On one axis, events: dinner, vineyard, yacht, villa brunch. On the other axis, vendor contracts and deposit status. I noted which deposits were refundable, which were not, and which required the client to provide explicit authorization for changes. Where there were gaps, I wrote potential remedies: refunds, postponements, or transfers. I did not write instructions about how to exploit systems. I wrote reminders to myself: stay lawful, document everything, proceed deliberately. Part of being a planner is knowing people's thresholds for discomfort. You do not push someone until the pressure reveals their sense of self. Eleanor's threshold had long been public opinion. She curated it with the kind of delicate cruelty that lives in a handshake. The missing place card showed she preferred the theater of exclusion over a frank conversation. She believed she could orchestrate an image that would corner me into seeing myself as second-rate. My resolve was not about revenge. It was about reclaiming a sense of order. If they were unwilling to recognize me in the small, public ways that bind people to each other, I would use the instruments of my career to create a consequence that was proportionate and visible. Not to humiliate for the thrill of humiliation, but to force the family to reckon with the reality that when you exclude someone who knows how the show runs, you risk undoing the show itself. That afternoon, I sat at a cafe a block from the restaurant and watched the city move through itself. Tourists clicked their cameras. A street vendor rolled up the canvas of his cart. My hands were steady. I texted Marco a brief, formal message. Due to urgent and unforeseen circumstances, Elite Affairs has been asked to evaluate the feasibility of tonight's dinner. Please hold service until we confirm. I will advise within the hour. Nothing theatrical, nothing cruel, procedural. It is possible to be methodical and furious in the same breath. Fury does not always need flamboyance. Sometimes it can be a ledger and a phone call and a preserved email. At the same time, I did not underrate the personal wound. Trust had been broken in the small, intimate way that cut the deepest. There was grief. There was a sense of betrayal so ordinary it felt marketable. When I finally re-entered the restaurant, it was different. They were lifting their glasses in a toast. Eleanor looked radiant in the way dominance sometimes appears as joy. The missing seat was a punctuation mark that said they had written a story into which I did not fit. I watched them for a while, like a theater-goer who has paid to see a dreadful act. I held my composure. I kept the records. I kept the receipts. My phone buzzed. It was Marco. He said quietly, "Signora Maloney, the bookings for the week. Villa, yacht, vineyard. Something's been flagged. The yacht company called. They say they cannot confirm until they hear from you." I smiled with humor. "Thank you," I said. "Please hold the dinner for 30 minutes. I'll be in touch." I left the table again. On the terrace, with the city stretching out below, I stared at my hands. There is something graphic about the way decisions look before you execute them, a grid in your mind with paths and dead ends. I had chosen a path that would expose the family's private matters to public embarrassment. It was a dangerous thing. But danger and legality are not synonyms. I had the contracts. I had my counsel. I had the documents that showed fiscal carelessness and a draft of a public statement meant to make the family's fracture sound like inevitability. There are quieter weapons than fury: persistence, record-keeping, the slow application of unavoidable facts. That night, I sat at a cafe by myself and began to write an email, a careful forensic account of what I had found and what actions I might be compelled to take if the family's finances did not reconcile, and if the company privileges they had given me were to be restored only nominally. I sent copies to my lawyer and to myself. It was a ledger of intention. Before I hit send, I closed the laptop and walked back toward the restaurant. Sean was standing near the doorway, as if he had expected me to reappear. His face had the strain of someone who had rehearsed apologies and found them insufficient. "Anna," he said, "please, come back in." I looked at him. His hands were empty. Around him, the family buzzed in small storms of laughter. He looked like a man wearing someone else's costume. I did not go back in. Instead, I said once, "Seems I'm not family." Then I turned and walked away. As I walked, I thought about the week of events like a set of dominoes carefully arranged. If I touched one at the right point, the rest would follow. I did not take pleasure in the anticipation. Pleasure implies a lightness I did not have. I took action with the flat, steady focus of someone who had spent her life constructing other people's spectacles and understood how they were built. I am telling you this much because the moment they excluded me was the hinge. The rest was machinery. There is a difficult grace in choosing how to respond when the world treats you as if you are optional. There is also a responsibility to yourself to act in ways that will not turn you into the sort of person you do not want to be. I sat down at a small table across the street and began to make calls and send carefully worded emails. I did not list them here like some caper worthy of a film. They were admin work dressed in the stakes of a marriage unraveling. As I hit send on the first formal cancellation notice, I felt a weight settle in my chest, less like triumph than the deep exhale of someone who has decided to end an untenable conversation. I had not yet seen the effect of those calls. I had not yet watched the room change tones or watched Eleanor's face blanch. The week was not yet over. The dominoes were lined. That is where I left it that night, sitting with the small, precise knowledge that I had exercised what authority I possessed, that I had safeguards in place, and that the rest would be up to the mechanics of contracts and people's reactions. I had not chosen spectacle. I had chosen a principle.
You do not exclude a person who knows the inner workings of the thing you ask them to build and expect nothing to be affected. And so the story continued, in the private channels of email, in the small polite confirmations from vendors that they had received my notice. The sequence was unfolding. There would be consequences, not the sort of cinematic vengeance that satisfies, but the sober public unspooling of an image that had long been polished.
If you want to hear how the family learned to read the ledger of its life, follow along. If you've ever been the one left without a place at the table, there is a modest, dignified set of tools you can use to reclaim your place in life. None of them perfect, all of them built on the discipline we call professionalism. Later that night, Sean knocked on the villa door. He was quiet. We spoke in half sentences and accusations that never fully took shape. He begged me to come back to the dinner. He promised to speak to his mother. He asked me not to make anything worse. I told him the truth, which is never simple. I could forgive a mistake. I could not live in a world where omission was the way he said he loved me. I told him I would be in the villa for the night and that I would discuss next steps in the morning with counsel. He left with a small, stunned apology. When he closed the door, the villa felt like a house emptied of the presumption of mirth. I lay awake, not because I feared what would happen, but because I understood that the choices before me were less about revenge and more about establishing a boundary. In the early hours, there was a gentle buzz from the restaurant. Marco had sent a single message. "We have placed a hold on services, awaiting your confirmation." The hour was thin and raw with possibility. I held my phone and watched the skyline as Rome breathed in sleep and light. I thought about the missing chair, about the way exclusion masquerades as etiquette. I thought about the contracts that, when needed, could become the skeleton key to reclaiming dignity. I did not sleep long. There was work to do. There is always work to do. The week that followed would test more than my patience. It would test the structural strength of rituals built to cover private failures. I am a planner. I had a plan. The rest, as they say, would be a matter of response. If this resonates, if you've ever been set aside, passed over, or told you do not belong, I hope this story will be something like a map. Not a how-to, not a manual for retaliation, but a testimony to the small, lawful levers we sometimes hold without knowing their weight. If you want to hear how the rooftop toast unraveled and what happened when a family faced the public consequences of their private omissions, follow me. There's more to this week than a missing place card. There are documents, decisions, and the slow, necessary accounting of a life once invested into someone else's story. I closed my laptop, sent notices through the channels I'd opened, and waited. The city indolently rolled into noon. I sipped black coffee and tried to keep my hands from shaking. There are things worse than humiliation, I reminded myself. Complicity, cowardice, the choice to pretend nothing was wrong. When the first vendor returned a message confirming a cancellation, the machine began to hum. It was not violent, it was administrative. But in its smallness, it was exact. The week they had planned for themselves was beginning to dissolve in ways they could no longer control. I stood up from the cafe table, folded the napkin like a fold in a design plan, and walked back toward the villa. There were conversations to be had. There were people, Sean, Eleanor, the family, to witness that I was not, by omission, invisible. The chair might have been missing, but I had not been willing to remain without a place in the ledger of my own life. The confirmations began like small, polite betrayals. An email from the florist with a subject line that read, "Re-service hold, awaiting instruction." A curt text from the yacht company that said, "Holding reservation per agent request." And then later, a phone call that arrived with a kind of soft, metallic inevitability. Marco's voice on the phone was quieter than it had been the night before. "Signora Malone," he said, "I'm so sorry. The sommelier has already sent a message. They're reallocating staff. The kitchen has to notify purveyors. There's no way to replace chilled fish on such short notice without a waste. They asked us to pause." "Thank you," I said. "Please keep me informed." It was the way people use the word pause, a useful euphemism for ripple, for cascade. Marco, in his careful way, was giving me the language of the room as it cracked. I could picture it, the chef checking stock lists, the maitre d' trying to keep voices gentle, Eleanor's guests still mid-toast, their glasses lifted as if to make a vow against embarrassment. Outside, Rome moved on, uncaring. I did not go to watch them panic. There is a strange sobriety to watching a plan you did not create come undone from the outside. I had the professional habit of not making scenes. Spectacle belonged to a younger, heedless self. Instead, I sat at a small table under an awning and waited for Marco to call back. When he did, he used fewer words.
Signora Malone, the yacht company has informed us they cannot staff this afternoon without confirmation of payment. The vineyard says their staff must be given notice or labor costs cannot be recovered. The villa staff are on standby, but they're requesting written direction. That phrase, written direction, was the hinge. Contracts can be spoken of in bars and private houses, but the moment a vendor asks for something in writing, you feel the weight of formality press down. It meant the week had moved beyond casual social annoyance into areas where accounting and policy had to be reckoned. Back at the villa, fingers that had once doodled table designs now sketched legal exactitudes. I sent the emails that were necessary, formal notices signing my firm's contract, explicit requests to hold or postpone services, copies to my counsel, copies to the vendors. Each message was calm and clinical. Each message was a record.
Each message, beneath its mild corporate phrasing, carried the force that only a documented instruction could. Word traveled in the family like a rumor that had been held in a gilded jar. Eleanor's laughter at the table turned thin. Sean's hands trembled in his lap. I imagine, for them, the unfolding was a humiliation because it was visible. For me, the humiliation had already happened earlier that evening in a smaller, quieter way. What made it so painful was not the collapse of a party, but the realization that decades of being treated as subsidiary could be countered by the very norms they expected would protect them. They sent for Carmen. She arrived, composed and impeccably dressed, as if she had walked from a theater rehearsal and was used to stepping into roles. She looked at me with a mixture of professional caution and the private curiosity of someone who runs a household like a machine. Her eyes flicked to the phone in my hand and then up to the rooftop. "Eleanor is asking for an explanation," she said softly. "I sent a hold notice," I replied. "Your team should have received it." Carmen's jaw tightened the way a person who understands the precariousness of reputation tightens under pressure. She excused herself, returning to the party. A few minutes later, the soft murmur of the table began to shift. Conversations that had been humming like a well-tuned string quartet broke into shorter, clipped phrases. Guests scanned their phones. A niece laughed a little too loudly, as if noise might stitch the moment back together. I stayed seated on the terrace where the breeze smelled faintly of lemon and oil. I did not seek their eyes. Power, I'd learned, is often a matter of where you let the story sit. Sean appeared at the edge of the terrace, moved by some compulsion to salvage. He stood with a bewildered apology on his face, the apology that arrives too late and reads the same whatever the infraction. "This is ridiculous," he said, in the low voice of someone trying to rehearse a defense. "Anna, please, call Marco. Tell them it's a mistake." "I already spoke to Marco," I said. I advised him to hold service until further confirmation. He took a breath that sounded like someone trying to dig themselves out of a hole. "This will look awful," he said. Mom set a place for 11, I said. She arranged a message. She made a choice." He reached for the cheap relief of a joke about miscounts. It did not work. What followed in the dining room was anticlimax and chaos braided together. The head waiter came out, face tight, and began to apologize in a way that tried to stitch dignity to the air. Eleanor stood and cleared her throat. She had the skill of a woman who had practiced commanding attention like a ritual. "This is an unfortunate confusion," she said, voice like china. "Our plans are changing." Guests clustered and chatted like a flock that senses the fox nearby. A whisper of financial mishap padded across the table from someone who liked drama thinly disguised as gossip. I watched the faces. Surprise, discomfort, a touch of righteous curiosity. People who had spent lives in a social economy that treated scandal as a tax on excitement. Then the phone calls began to land with a particular cadence. Marco called the maitre d', who was on site. The maitre d' called the owner of the restaurant. The owner called a contact at the yacht company. The yacht company reached the broker. Each link transferred the same message. The planner had issued a hold pending client instruction. If clients couldn't confirm, vendors would not be held liable for waste, and some deposits would need to be refunded. There was a procedural inevitability to the way these things cascade. Accounts, schedules, perishables, threads that, when pulled, take a seam with them.
Eleanor's face was a study in controlled defense. "Anna," she said, the name and accusation clipped short. "What are you doing?" "What I'm required to do," I answered. My voice had the flat honesty of a report. "I am the contracted planner for several of these services. I have a fiduciary duty to act in the best interest of the events and to prevent unnecessary waste or expense. I have received information that requires clarification." Her eyebrows rose, as though she had misheard. "Clarification? From whom?" "From the documentation I encountered last night and the draft statement I found," I said, "and from the discovery of certain communications. There are questions about allocations and authorizations. I am following the terms of our agreements. Confrontation has different textures. Eleanor chose the old aristocratic brand. Oh, how dare you! How dare you make the stage wobble?" She recited the kind of sanctimonious lines that belong to those who believe moral authority flows from social rank. "You are making a spectacle," she said. "I'm not making a spectacle," I said. "I'm giving vendors a formal instruction based on the contracts they've honored with my firm. If you wish to resume service, you can provide the required authorizations." Those were not empty words. It was a legal and contractual fact that some vendors required client confirmation. It was also a fact that my firm had been the designated agent on multiple line items. The vendors were doing what they were paid to do, respond to the documented authority they had been given. If press or neighbors chose to interpret that as something else, that was their prerogative. My concern remained narrower: to preserve the record, prevent waste, and ensure I did not commit an act that would later undo me. Sean tried Ben, in the way the conflicted do, to play balancer. "We can fix this," he said, voice hopeful. Eleanor's laugh was like a folding fan. "Pay, Tony? Is Anna implying we are not capable of resolving a dinner?" It was a game of small humiliations.
The missing seat had been one. The cancellations were another. Eleanor armed herself with pride because it had always served as shield. But even shields show cracks when the weight of logistics bears down. A guest, who had once been a client of Elite Affairs and had respect for how I handled crises, leaned forward. "Is there a way to salvage the evening?" she asked. "An alternative? A smaller reception?" The suggestion was practical. It was charity dressed as a solution. But there are times when a fracture is more than cosmetic. I had seen events where one wrong decision made the rest look fatuous. I declined to be the person who would paper over a family choice that had excluded me while expecting the machinery of their social life to hum on unchanged. "I will be sending a formal statement to vendors," I said. "If there's client authorization to resume any services, it should be sent in writing to Elite Affairs with the necessary signatories. Until then, vendors are obliged to follow the hold." It felt like telling the world something that had been true for a long time, but which people preferred not to hear. Actions have consequences. The crowd shuffled, some rising to leave, others staying, drawn to the drama like moths to a porch light. At that point, someone produced their phone, and the small window that had been a private draft found its way to a screen visible to more eyes than it was meant for. The proposed family statement, polished, tidy, suspiciously managerial, slid into view. There was a line about personal matters and mutual respect, and a shorthand of damage control. It was the kind of document that made betrayal read like an inevitability rather than an injury. The table grew noisier. Tears, accusations, and then the thin clarity that comes from being seen. I did not gloat. I simply sat and watched the social architecture I had been asked to maintain begin to crumble under its own contradictions. After an hour of shifting phone calls and guests leaving in small groups, Eleanor rose with a face that had gone papery. She looked like someone whose armor had been dented by an unexpected blow. "This is not over," she said, voice sharp. "This is simply inconvenient." "Then the appropriate remedy is to provide authorization," I said. "If you wish to resume services, it should be documented." Sean, looking as if the world had become a stage he had not learned his lines for, tried to step toward me. "Anna," he began. "Seems I'm not family," I said, quietly.
My phrase landed in the space between us, not as an outcry, but as a simple, immovable fact. It was not theatrical. It was declarative. It was the line I had used the night the place card was absent, and saying it again felt less like reliving an insult than naming a truth. He flinched, not from the words themselves, but from the way they owned a reality he had been living in halves. Around him, the party continued to fold.
People shook hands awkwardly, promising phone calls they would not make. The press, which exists to translate private pain into public narrative, arrived a few days later. The Beacon and Bay, our city's society column that liked to call itself a friendlier cousin to scandal, ran a piece that was careful and interested. Caldwell's celebration interrupted. Questions arise. It did not scream accusation. It asked. That in the court of social reputation is often more dangerous. Questions invite others to peek behind curtains, to notice patterns. A freelance reporter from a wider circulation outlet reached out asking for comment. I forwarded her a statement that was brief and factual. The planner had placed holds pending authorization, contractual obligations had been followed, inquiries about the family's private matters were best directed to their representatives. I did not invite speculation. I did not indulge in the theatrics of victimhood. The statement read like the work I had been trained to do. Limit damage, clarify roles, protect the people involved as best as possible while acknowledging reality. In the days that followed, more documentation made its way into my hands inadvertently. Bank memos, scribbled notations, and the kind of minor slips people make when they treat oversight as a tool rather than a duty. I added those to the file, scanned them, and ensured my counsel had copies. My attorney, a pragmatic woman who had grown up in the same Boston neighborhood as my first clients, advised carefully. "We will preserve everything," she said. "We will not make public statements beyond the necessary. If there is mismanagement, that is for the proper authorities or the family's decisions. Our priority is your protection." I had not entered this with the aim of public reckoning. My aim was simpler and more self-preserving, to ensure I could walk away without my career or finances tied into a story that had been authored in omission. The law, in its dry way, provided boundaries that allowed me to act without becoming the spectacle. I had never wanted to be the kind of person who made humiliation a hobby. Sean attempted to repair in the ways of someone who still wanted benefits and detested consequences. He offered apologies that repeated themselves. "I didn't know. It wasn't meant like that. We can fix this." His appeals struck me as attempts to reinsert himself into a narrative where he had been permitted to remain in the center. But the center had shifted. Whether it was his choice to step into clarity or to stay under the shade of his mother's reputation was no longer my burden. Then came a private message from someone who had been involved with the family's financial side for years, a discreet email that suggested a formal inquiry might be unavoidable if the gaps could not be reconciled. The line was careful. "We recommend a thorough review to preserve family assets."
It was suggestion, not accusation, but once suggestion enters a household like the Caldwells, it has a way of turning into headline. In the weeks after, the Beacon and Bay and other columns noted, with various degrees of coyness, that the Caldwells were being more closely scrutinized by their accountants. Vanessa's name soon began to appear in the edges of the story, as all second acts do. She, it turned out, was expecting. That fact complicated nothing and everything. For Sean, the prospect of fatherhood in a new family with someone who had not been built into Eleanor's circuits of patronage offered both escape and a new, easier narrative. Vanessa was young, and she was already installed as a neutral presence in the family's orbit, neither a scandal nor a redeemer, but a figure who could be styled into the role the family needed. I did not begrudge anyone their path. People make choices with different currencies. Mine had been invested in work, in the slow accumulation of reputation, and in the principle of not allowing omission to define my story. What surprised me was less what others chose than how quickly the world rearranged to accommodate those choices. Within months, relatives who had been brusque in person sent formal notes that read like apologies in the voice of a publicist. Sean and Vanessa announced their engagement, then their wedding, both small affairs by Caldwell standards, but intensely photographed by a social media ecosystem that mistakes image for truth. My divorce proceedings were sober and concise. There were discussions of property and of the financial entanglements that had to be unwound. I had counsel who focused on protecting what was mine, the company I had built, the accounts I had managed, and my right to privacy. We negotiated with the care of people who understood that unspooling a life together required precise documentation and the avoidance of theatrics. That was perhaps the most civilized part of it. There were sunset clauses and non-disparagement provisions, and the court of law moved with its own bureaucratic delicacy. I do not recount the details of the settlement because the specifics belong to forms and filings. I will say this: my name remained on my business, and my firm retained the client relationships that had grown outside the Caldwell orbit. My life, which had been threaded through the brownstone and the parties, returned to a table that I set myself. There was grief in losing some parts of what I'd once hoped marriage would be. There was also a clear-headed relief at being released from a role I had been asked to play without consent. Professionally, the ripple was not all harm. People respected clarity and fidelity to contract. New clients came with the quiet recognition that I had, in the middle of a crisis, chosen discipline over drama.
I planned less for show and more for substance. A museum opening where the guest list would be strictly curated, a wedding that put the couple's values at the center, a small symposium where indigenous designers were invited rather than tokenized. The work grounded me, and grounding is its own redemption. There were moments, of course, when I considered the private cost. Sean's face, sometimes in the quiet hours, would cross my mind in a way that felt less like anger and more like the loss of potential. He was not a villain template. He was a man shaped by his inheritance and fears. I never sought to demonize him. We divorced without rancor, because rancor would have been indulgent, and because the moral high ground I insisted upon was not the perch for vindictiveness. The Caldwells fared as families do when their private mess meets public curiosity. Some doors closed, some reputations required repair, and some relationships knitted in new ways. Vanessa and Sean married quietly in a small ceremony on Martha's Vineyard, photos that made it into social columns looking prim and composed. Eleanor's social calendar thinned for a season and then resumed with the slow, deliberate patience of someone accustomed to being consulted on matters of taste. The press ran pieces that balanced the human with the curious. A society columnist mused on the capriciousness of privilege and the inevitable complications of curated lives. No one went to jail. There were no dramatic show trials. There were instead the subtler forms of consequence, reputational strain, accountants' memos, and the occasional reconfigured trust. I did not celebrate their discomfort. I acknowledged it with the kind of empathy I extend to anyone confronted with the consequences of their choices. I had not engineered a spectacle for pleasure. I had exercised authority in the narrow confines of my contracts. That distinction mattered to me because it preserved my moral coherence. There is a difference between making someone suffer and standing firm for one's dignity. Months later, I found myself back in Italy, but this time by choice. A client, enchanted with the idea of an intimate ceremony in a hilltop town at Florence, commissioned Elite Affairs to design an evening that would be both simple and luminous. I booked a small villa with terraced gardens, a local band with a violinist who knew how to make a melody float like a bird, and a caterer who treated every herb like a promise. I took the job because it was the kind of work that had once made me fall in love with my trade, the possibility of creating a night that would be remembered for its kindness rather than its gloss. On the first evening of the event, as the sun slid behind cypress trees and the light turned the terracotta red, the guests gathered under linen bunting and the long table glowed with candles. There were place cards, each positioned deliberately, each hand-lettered by a calligrapher we trusted. I was not the bride. I was not the honored guest. I was the planner who had been invited to do the work she loved without the entanglement of being made invisible. I stood back while the dinner began. There was a moment when I walked past the table and noticed a small gap where a chair had been shifted by an assistant to accommodate a late guest. I smiled inwardly because the image connected me to a certain kind of past. I could have been the absent one that night, the person who was expected to disappear into someone else's story. Instead, I watched the meal unfold with a calm appreciation that felt like reclamation. At the end of the evening, the couple asked if I would join them for a nightcap on the villa's terrace. The stars were thick and impartial. We raised our glasses, Prosecco that huffed like cold breath, and there was no talk of scandal, no need for explanations. The toast was simple: to beginnings that are chosen. Later, alone for a moment, I poured a small measure of wine into a glass and held it up. The light caught the liquid and made it amber. I thought of the missing seat on the rooftop in Rome and felt no triumphant glee. I felt a quiet gratitude for the clarity that Exclusion had afforded me. The missing chair had been, in its own brutal, small way, a kind of gift. It made visible what had been assumed. If you're listening to this and have ever known the cold algebra of being deemed optional, know this:
Absence can reveal things that presence had hidden, and there are lawful, measured ways to assert your worth, not as an act of show, but as an act of self-preservation. This story ends not with vengeance, but with a regained life. The company continues. The ledger is balanced. The clients I keep are those who want their ceremonies to honor the people at their center, not the social capital that surrounds them. I sleep better. I work with fewer demands for compromised integrity. I travel when I want. I eat lunch on a bench without checking who might be there to judge my choice of sandwich. I keep a small card in my planner now, not as a talisman, but as a reminder. On it I wrote, the night after the rooftop, "You deserve a place at the table you build." I look at that card when I sign contracts, when I advise vendors, and when a client asks for something that feels like erasure. The missing chair in Rome was more than a seat left empty. It was an articulation of a world that had room for appearances and not for people. Canceling the week of events was not a tantrum, it was a recalibration. And when the dust settled, the thing I recovered was not a petty vengeance, but a sense of boundary and the permission to step out of a script that no longer fit me. If this resonates, if you've ever been pushed to the margins of a group you thought you belonged to, I'm glad you were here to listen. There are other stories I have of people who rebuilt themselves quietly and with dignity. If you'd like to hear more, follow along.
I tell these stories because people deserve to know that being sidelined does not have to be the end of their agency. Raise a glass, sometime, to the chair that wasn't set. It is a strange and fortunate instrument. It tells you where you have been excluded and guides you toward where you must stand instead. If this story found you, follow me for more stories of reinvention and the small, lawful ways people reclaim their lives.